go ahead and get started. You can understand that when I suggested last time that we might have some homework and folks don't show up, you know what that means. So we want to look at the text for the fourth Sunday in Lent. And the gospel text, which will, of course, this is for next Sunday. The gospel text will be what we already know, has to do with what has become known as the parable of the prodigal son. Okay, and so we will look at that more extensively in the next hour or so. But I want to begin with the Joshua text, which begins with, I have essentially rolled you away from disgrace. And it is believed that the slavery in Egypt was a time of disgrace, a time of humiliation. It's often an interesting exercise in language. Even when the root is the same, derivatives might lead us to think differently. So, for example, when I use the word justice, does it conjure up something that is positive or negative? Positive. But when we use the word judgment, okay, it's separate. Okay. When we use the word humble, right? Positive, right? Like being tops in humility. But of course, humiliation has that negative sort of overtone. And so this is a time of disgrace, according to Joshua, because the people were in, according to the text, right, a time of disgrace because of the humiliation that they had to deal with. And we might remember that there was not a single member of the folks who wandered in the wilderness, remember that story, who ended up in the promised land, including our friend Moses, right? It's become kind of the metaphor that Moses was able to do what? Right? He was on the mountaintop, right? He was old, his hand had to be held up, and when he saw the promised land, right? And that's become known. I was reminded this week, once again, of the importance of the importance of the humanities for everyday life. And so I was speaking with a colleague who is an administrator, whose background is in the sciences, and makes decisions about everything, institutionally. And I said, how is life on the mountaintop? We were at a Zoom meeting, and he looked at me and I said, mountaintop, Martin Luther King, Moses. I moved on. I never quite got, and I said, well, I suppose that's in my realm. But I never quite got the reaction that said, oh yeah, I get it. It was always the blank look. So here they were, and now they're out of Egypt. They never got a chance to be in the promised land. But it's a reminder. You remember what Martin Luther famously was asked that if he were to die today, what would he do? He would plant a tree. Okay? And it sounds, well, isn't that special? Kind of. Except, of course, the only way that works is to believe in that which comes after you for the next generation and the next generation. For those who could actually enjoy it, for those who could actually prosper from it, for those who could actually enter into the land that you were not able to enter into. Okay? So it is not only for ourselves, it is for those who come after us. And in a way, for a little bit of time, okay, let me get this right here. For a little bit of time, we have this idea. Remember what today we might call the Stockholm syndrome, right? Where you have been in captivity for so long, or in exile for so long, or in bondage for so long, you begin to take on what?
Culturalization.
Yeah, you kind of take on the culture, you begin to start thinking along the lines of your captors, right? And we have a hint of that early on because, of course, remember, no sooner were they free, they began to say what? I long for the time when we were sitting by the flesh pots and eating leeks. Okay? Did you bring us here simply to have us die of hunger? So the book, this text from Joshua, if you will, has to do with a reminder, if you will, of what was and what will be, what will become in the time, in the days ahead, and so on. And then we get to the 2 Corinthian text, which is the text, Paul's letter from Paul's second letter to the Corinthians. Now, I want to give a little bit of background on this. With the exception of one letter in the New Testament, okay, all of Paul's letters were what we might call response letters. Okay? The only exception is the book of Romans. That's the only exception. Okay? There were response letters. Now you can begin to imagine the challenges here. Okay? If I begin a letter that says, "It was so great to hear from you," and to answer your question, yes, I would love to. Okay? And, oh yes, let's meet. And the time that you travel by train from Chicago to, right, was so wonderful. And can you believe, imagine these are all responses. And the only way that we could figure out what the original was is to what? Process of deduction, right? We will read the response letters and try to figure out what exactly did they write about. Because we don't have those originals. And so we are reading Paul's sort of responses to what the people might have asked. And we have to figure out, one, that, and we are living in a time, I'll give you an example in a second, and there are many, but we have to believe that what Paul is giving by way of his answers accurately reflects what the questions were. Now, is that always the case? No. And you don't believe me? Okay? I'm not suggesting you do this for your own health. But sometimes, if you have a moment, listen to the back and forth, if you will, in what is happening in politics today. I'm posing a question to you, and you don't want to answer. What do? Yes, you deflect, and by the way, you give me an answer that has no bearing to the question. Okay? By the way, you don't have to go hunting for those examples. They're all over the place. If you don't want to answer the question, what do?
Talk about something.
Talk about something else. But we have to believe that what Paul is doing here, right, is accurate. I mean, we have to believe that, or else we're really in trouble. We don't have the original stuff. So, I want to read. For we know that if the earthly tent we lived in is destroyed, we have a building from God, a house not made with hands, eternal in heavens. Okay? You have to believe this, it says. So, again, let me pose this question to you. Can you give me, help me here. By the way, we're going to get to the prodigal son, your homework assignment here. So don't start thinking that I forgot. Could you give me, maybe in your own sort of thinking, the distinction that you would make between faith and trust? I know we sometimes use it interchangeably, as we often do, right?
I trust the data.
You trust the
I
data.
have faith in things where I have the data.
Okay. And the data could be factual, maybe. But not every fact
But
is
it's all
true.
the data I have.
Okay, and you trust it.
Well, you again, you trust, but then always question, and then you all the data. I mean, we don't need to get into dialectic and things like that, but I think that faith is belief in the absence of the data. And trust is when I have the data flawed or complete as it might be.
Okay.
And I reason based upon,
Okay.
or it could be wrong.
I love this. I will build this castle, but it might collapse. Okay.
It's humility.
It's humility, that's right.
President Reagan's favorite saying is trust.
Trust.
But verify.
Well, verify.
Or another one is, all models are wrong, but some are useful.
Okay.
I mean, I have friends who think an atom is a bunch of little balls going around other little balls. I mean, clearly absurd, but it's a very, very useful model.
Okay. How do we arrive at trust? Experience?
Consistency.
Consistency? So we may have faith in something that we cannot see, right? Or we may not know, but we have been told. And so we begin to envision, perhaps, but then we trust. We trust. So I'll give you an example. When our older son was very young, and he was about, I'm guessing he was about 2 or so. And I was in graduate school, and we were in an apartment. And in this apartment, there were windows that looked out onto a large playing field, soccer field and that sort of thing. And the windows, however, were about here. Okay, they were very, so for folks like us, we can stand up and just look out. But for a 2-year-old, right, it was not possible. But there were ledges that were very wide. So regularly, I would hold my son, put him on the ledge. He would look out of the window and just look at folks playing. Okay? Those were simpler days. Okay? And then when, the interest waned, he turned around, and on one occasion I said, stand there, Nathan. I'm going to count from 1 to 3 and jump. And when you're a child, right, he's standing on the ledge. I counted to 3, I think I got to 3, and he leaped off the ledge, and I caught him. And then, what do you imagine he said after that?
Let's do it again.
Let's do it again. And again. Day after day. Yeah. And we did it. And then one day it stopped, right? And then years later, as he's grown up, we were at some event, and we were coming up the stairs, 2 at a time, 3 at a time, as sometimes we do. And I told him, stop, halfway. And I said to him, jump, I'm gonna catch you. And he said to me, Dad, you're nuts. I am not jumping. So somewhere along the line, between faith and trust, all right? This is a text that says, listen, you're going to have to believe me, is what it says. You're going to have to believe me, and you're going to have to believe me on the basis of what I have already done. You're going to have to believe me on the basis of what. Now, you may not see this, but here's what I have done. And I'm going to send to you the Spirit to ensure that you will continue according to this. And it goes on, and then it ends on this note. And I want to read to you the last section of this letter. As someone famously said, 2 Corinthians. Okay? I want to read the last section of this letter and see which word leaps off the page for you. All this, starting with verse 18, all this is from God, who reconciled us to himself through Christ, and has given us the ministry of reconciliation. That is, in Christ, God was reconciling the world to himself, not counting their trespasses against them, and entrusting the message of reconciliation to us. So, we are ambassadors for Christ, since God is making this appeal through us. We entreat you on behalf of Christ, be reconciled to God. For our sake, he made him to be sin who knew no sin, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. Okay? If I said to you, just on the basis of that section of the letter, what would you consider to be the emphasis? Reconciliation. By the way, if you miss that, you have not been paying attention. Okay? It's like, you need to be reconciled. And by reconcile, I mean reconciliation. In case you didn't get reconciliation, what I'm talking about is reconciliation. I mean, it keeps repeating. Now, reconciliation presupposes something. It presupposes that we have a relationship of some sort. Okay? The word conciliation, interestingly, means something like unity. Actually, the Latin root has a meaning of unity and assembly. So, to be reconciled, it's not, you can't just be reconciled onto yourself. It is a relational word. And here, we're told you need to be reconciled. You need reconciliation. And reconciliation means that there is a fracture in the unity of community. Excuse me. Sounds familiar? How do we reconcile with each other? There is nothing in this text that says, look into the index for an answer. How do we reconcile with each other? And it presupposes that we have a relationship that is now broken, that is now fractured. And how do we repair that? Sometimes with forgiveness. Apology.
Isn't this like go and do likewise? I mean, God was in Christ reconciling the world, so now go and do likewise.
Go and do likewise.
You have to communicate first, I think.
Communicate.
So do you,
Well, we talked about this, that most of the relationships not all, but the majority of the relationships that we find in the text, the sacred text that we have read and heard about, when brokenness happens, it's because the people have not been listening. Right? Listening. Here is the thing about this. We cannot speak about reconciliation as if it's some kind of theoretical idea. Well, we just have to be reconciled to each other. We just have to sort of listen and move on. The practical reality is that when the brokenness or the fracture is deep enough, it takes more than simply saying, well, it'll be fine. In fact, if we're honest with each other, what we can see in front of us reminds us that it's not going to be fine. Maybe it will be in time. How do we restore a relationship that has been fractured? Martha Nussbaum, who I think is still at the University of Chicago, might be close to retirement, is a philosopher. She is both in the Department of Philosophy and law, in law school. And Martha Nussbaum famously said, among many things, right, that we human beings are flawed crystals. Okay? And the flaw, and so it's both. There's beauty and wonder and goodness on the one hand, and right here, there are flaws. Now, if in fact that flaw is just tiny, I think reconciliation might be somewhat, if not easier, much more forthcoming. If that flaw is really a chasm that divides in a way that you cannot imagine how we come together, reconciliation at that point is a very, very difficult thing. And we don't know what all that original letter said, except clearly something was happening in the Corinthian community that needs to come together once again and be unified. Do you remember in South Africa when, at least in terms of, well, I'll put it this way, when apartheid ended, officially, right? Some things might end officially, and of course it's still very much, into the consciousness and lives of people. What was one of the things that they tried to do? Let me rephrase that. What was one of the things that they did as a way to ensure that the communities that had been so broken and divided, what did they do?
Committees of reconciliation.
It was called the Truth and Reconciliation Committee, led by, Archbishop Desmond Tutu. It's very difficult. By the way, did everyone participate? No. Because they couldn't bring themselves to be able to say what we did was in many respects monstrous and horrible and terrible, but it was the only way to bring together a fracture that had been deep and for a long time. Northern Ireland, right? If I mentioned that to 18-year-olds, could you say more? But we know the history there, right? On the one hand, right, you have Ian Paisley, and yet these guys would sit at the same table, and it runs deep. And yet reconciliation might have to do with how we sit and listen to each other. We don't have a script. And we are living in a time. I'll give you an example because it's public. There was a town hall. Evidently, this is the season for town halls. Right? There's a town hall, I think it might have been Friday, perhaps, in Iowa, the great state of Iowa. And Senator Chuck Grassley, remember Senator Chuck Grassley? Is having a town hall. And you can see it, this is not something that I'm making up. In that event, you have a 70-year-old person in the town hall who stood up. It was a very moving moment, I found, who stood up and said, Senator Grassley is about 90, I think, if I'm not mistaken, or something, right? And she is 70. And she said, Senator, I have always admired you. I always looked up to you as my senator for decades and decades and decades. I'm 70 years of age, and Senator, I am scared. That's her language. She said, Senator, I am scared. Why haven't you done something about the division that is happening in our society? You can go see this. This is 2 days ago, 3 years ago. How do you reconcile? That was the question. This was not, I'm on the right, or I'm on the left, or I'm in the center. This is a person who said, I'm 70 years of age, Senator, and I have always respected and admired you. And essentially, why is it that you are betraying us by not doing something to bridge this divide that is happening in our society? Reconciliation is not easy. It is not straightforward, but it is relational, and if in fact we go back to the root, it has to do with an assembly and unity of the people. That's the root of the word. So, there's a phrase in Hebrew, tikkun olam. Okay? It simply means restoration forever. It is what it is. And some often translated healing. There are some scholars who believe that if you wanted, I'm not saying we should, but if you wanted to collapse the teaching and ministry of Jesus into one word, it would be healing. And you can take that literally and figuratively. Okay? To be reconciled one with another. Now, the parable of the prodigal son. Just the parable of the prodigal son, and I feel somewhat badly that Pastor Jan is walking in here. And my wife just left. And I know that I could be in some kind of trouble, except she's on call, so I know that was somewhere along there it happened. All right. So Luke chapter 15 and the parable of the prodigal son. In my view, in the historical catalog, by the way, this is all make-believe now, there is no historical catalog. But in the historical catalog of human consciousness, where language of lost and found, as in L-O-S-T, and found, or loss and redemption are found. this story stands apart. It's a story. Now, before I get into this story, I asked you last time to read this, and I suggested that you should read it and then what? Read it again. Okay? And then I asked you anything that strikes you in this story. It was very open-ended. There's no, and there is no hidden answer here. So I'm going to ask you now, before we get into this, what struck you in this story?
I think it should have been called the Parable of the Loving Father.
Okay? It should have been called the Parable of the Loving Father. Okay? But no one asked us.
I would build upon that, because I think of it as the parable of the prodigal one.
The Parable of the Prodigal Father. Okay? All right. By the way, we will tackle that in a second. I'm cataloging these things. There's a lot of space up here. I haven't been using it much.
I come away from that story thinking, boy, that other brother sure got the shaft.
The other brother got the shaft.
It wasn't fair.
It wasn't fair. Funny thing about fairness and grace. Okay? The other brother got the shaft.
Kind of along the same lines, it's like they have become polarized, the siblings, and the father is loving, all right, but in spite of his loving, the kids are not wholesome. Both needed to change.
The father is loving, but these kids cannot get along. That's it. By the way, let me ask you here. I don't want to reduce this to something that is very mundane. Any elder sibling here?
Yes.
Any youngest sibling here? Do we naturally, as the youngest sibling, identify with the younger son? Necessarily? How about the older siblings? Okay. Because the younger ones always get away with stuff, right?
Trial and error ones.
The older ones are the trial and error, and then the younger ones reap the benefits. Is that what you're saying? I profoundly disagree, but of course I'm the youngest, so.
My sister would disagree with that as well. She always thought I was more favored than she
There's a huge gap between, I have 5 sisters. There's a huge gap between my youngest of the 5 sisters and me. Okay, 13 years. I don't know what happened. And, you know, once I remember telling that younger sister, who really is lacking in sense of humor, that I was the most beloved child. And she said, we never really wanted to let you know. Actually, we found you. The beach. And took pity. So, here's what we want to begin talking about. Of course, as you can imagine, there is no such thing in the Greek as the prodigal son. It doesn't exist. Okay? There is no such title. It doesn't exist. It only really came about into the 16th century, really. Okay? Centuries after. And what we will hear next Sunday, I don't know who's preaching next Sunday. It could be Pastor. What we will hear next Sunday is only the prodigal son parable. But before that, there are 2 short parables as well. Okay? Okay? It's not part of, they're not using part of the lectionary, and I wish that they would. But the first, you may remember, right, is the parable of the lost sheep, where the shepherd goes after looking for the one. And who takes care of the 99?
About themselves.
No one, right? So presumably there is some trust there that they will not just say, remember, like Aaron in Exodus, Moses is having a summit with God and Aaron is in charge down here, and the people are saying, you know,
You want to go?
what about that golden calf? Can we build one? And Aaron says,
Oh, sure.
sure, why not? Right?
The staff with snakes seem to work.
Yeah, of course. So, the 99 are left, which means that sometimes, right, in these circumstances, there's also the quality of risk. I mean, there's a risk here that you're going to leave behind this, but the importance of this one is such that I will take a risk. And let's be very clear about this. Again, we see it in sacred texts, but we also see it in everyday life. There is a tension between security and risk. There is a tension. Now, I don't know about you, but I think many of us in our younger days maybe climbed trees. Yeah, right? We used to climb. I grew up climbing trees. Most of the trees that we climb, that let's say that have fruits, you know, maybe it's a large trunk. And if you climb up on those trees and you sit on one of the massive branches in the kind of the crook of it, you can sit there all day if you wish and be very safe. That's not a bad thing. I used to do that, sometimes peeking over a fence so I can see a crooked match. I did that. But here's the thing. It is only when you go out on the branches that you could possibly find and reach the fruit. Okay? You can sit in the crook of that trunk all day long and be secure. Or you can take a risk. And by the way, I can tell you right now, how far you go, you will have to make that determination. But that's the only way you will find that fruit. So, the shepherd did. And there was joy, right? And celebration. Pause for a second. Where do you think the focus in that parable should be? On who? Is it on the sheep? Or on the shepherd? Shepherd, right? And then the next very short parable has to do with the woman who lost a coin. And maybe most folks would say, whatever. Yeah, no, that's a coin, right? But the value of it is such that you are willing and able to search every place, and when you find that coin, there is joy and celebration. Now, here's the thing. With the lost sheep, the shepherd went out looking. With the lost coin, the woman went out searching. With the son, the father never did. He remained at home. And you have this interesting tension between freedom and authority. And the belief maybe, just maybe the belief that he will come back home again. Now, you know this saying, right? You can't step in the same river twice. I have this up here, not because it's cute, but we read this text, and every time we read the parable of the prodigal son, or any text, right? You read it again, and something changes. It is never the same again. It could be either a tone, it could be a word, it could be an insight, it could be something. We can't step in the same river twice, even if we do it within a second. Something changes. Same with this story. So what we have here is this. This parable is only in the Gospel of Luke. Okay? It's not in Matthew, it is not in Mark, and it most certainly is not in John. John doesn't have parables. And what this means, at least in part, is this. We have to ask ourselves, what is it about Luke that this parable emphasizes? It's relationship, and for Luke, again and again and again, you have the concept of unconditional love. Again and again and again. Unconditional love. What does Luke emphasize in his Gospels? There is freedom and responsibility. There is estrangement and redemption. There is grace. There is anguish. There is reconciliation. It's all there in Luke. And we see it in spades here. Now, I put this up here for us to think about this. This might not ring a bell for you, and that's fine. Shemot simply means, it's the plural Hebrew word that means names, as in Shem, okay? As in Shemuel, the name of God, Samuel. Okay? It means names. Exodos is Latin. Does that ring a bell? This is where we get the word Exodus from. Okay? But in the Hebrew, the name of the book is Shemot, not Exodus. Okay? The second, Bamidbar. Okay? Under the B there is pronounced as a V, Bamidbar. Okay? Literally means in the wilderness. Okay? Anyone knows what the name of that book is that we have inherited? Numbers. Now you think for a second how different our approach and thinking might be if instead of Exodus we're looking at the names. If instead of numbers we're talking about the narrative of being in the wilderness. I'm saying all of that because here is the thing. Prodigal. There is no prodigal in the story. In German, right? If you know a little German, literally it means the lost son. Someone translated the forlorn son, the lost son. And in the Vulgate, the earliest translation of the Bible into Latin, okay, the filio prodigal, okay, literally the prodigal son. But who is the centerpiece of this story? It is the Father. Because how does the story begin? The story begins, there was a man who had 2 sons. That's how the story begins. There was a man who had 2 sons. This is the story about a man who happened to have 2 sons. It's not about a son who is a prodigal son, if you will, which I think is misguided personally. But as we have discovered, no one wrote and asked us what we thought. Maybe just as well. So why could it not be the prodigal father? The word prodigal means what? Extravagant. It's the word that gives us prodigy. It's the word that gives us prodigious. Right? It does not have to be a negative thing. Maybe it should be the prodigious grace, the extravagant grace of this father. But in fact, the focus is on the son. And it's interesting. I remember my professor in graduate school discussing parables and famously saying, in the parables of Jesus, There's only one main point. And when you're a student, right, and that is your professor, you assume that that person, of course, walks on water. On the exam, right. Afterwards, you can argue. After the exam is over and the semester is over, you want to go back and say, how about that one point in the parable? Okay. But even that we didn't do. By the way, things have changed these days, as you can imagine. Half of the time, I have students who are, complaining about a grade, and they're, and I need to see the dean, and, this professor is unfair, and by the way, 99 point something percent, ding ding, it's not true, right? But I might as well try. But I'm sorry to say they were wrong. There is always more to these parables than, quote, only one point. There's more, of course. There's always more to the stories. So, what do we have here? Is it fair? It's not fair. Why is it not fair? Is it, by the way, let me just put this on the table. Is there any place that we have read theologically now, in theology, that Jesus died for fairness? I don't think so. If that was the case, we'd be in a lot of trouble. But is it because we use this language, right? The older son, or, let's be very clear, the older brother, is he working hard? Is he in the field? Yes. Does he deserve more? All of a sudden, I'm hearing murmurings. Okay.
In this culture, was there primogeniture? Should we assume that the older brother was eventually going to inherit all this stuff anyway, and none at all? Or is that not necessarily?
There is every indication that between the brothers, the older brother would get 2/3 of the inheritance. So it's not even split equally. Okay, and there is a place for the primogenitor, the firstborn, right? And by the way, that's a cultural thing that spans a variety of different cultures and religions, right? That maybe the older brother will continue. It's interesting, in my family, the eldest child is a brother, is a son. And I'm the youngest, and we have 7 siblings. They're not all, sadly, still with us, but the understanding was that the eldest child, who happened to be a son, would, inherit. We didn't have much to inherit, but inherit, the family sort of home and small business and carry on. That was just the way it was. Okay? Now, so what happened here is, and I will read this quickly. So he divided the property between them. The younger son said, I want to go out and, see what the world is like. Did the father stop him? No. Did the father say, I want you to sort of, take a couple of days to think about this? No. And nowhere in this story do we have an interaction between the brothers. Nowhere in this story. There is no fraternal relationship that exists in this story. We don't know what it was like. And so the father says he divided the property between them. A few days later, the young son gathered all that he had, traveled to a distant country, and then he squandered his property in dissolute living. Okay? And again, we don't have an index that says under dissolute living, C, right? You can make up whatever it is that you imagine. When he had spent everything, a severe famine took place throughout the country and he began to be in need. So he went and he hired himself out to one of the citizens of that country, and who sent him to the fields to feed the pigs. Now, we understand where you have arrived at that point, right? You are feeding the pigs. And he would gladly have filled himself with the pods that the pigs were eating, and no one gave him anything. For me, it is the next line that changes everything. Everything. But when he came to himself, and that, for me, changes everything. Oscar Wilde famously said, all of us human beings, someplace in our lives, find ourselves in a ditch. It's a terrible imagery. The difference is that some of us lie face looking upwards. Okay? That's the only way to come to yourself. He came to himself. Some translation says when he found himself, for example. He came to himself. The Jerusalem Bible said when he came to his senses. Maybe. There was when did he find himself? Everything. In the depth of despair. Isn't that where hope most often finds its best expression? In the depth of despair. It's somewhat ironic that is in the depth of hopelessness that often hope becomes alive. In the depth of despair, he found himself, not when his father loved him, and the brother is out in the field, and maybe he is ticked off. Why is the brother really upset? Not because the younger brother came back home.
Because the father threw a party and gave him robes.
I thought you were waving at me. And it's the party. It's the party. Listen, if you want to come home, that's fine. I'm not happy about this, by the way, that fact that you left anyway. Well, we're going to have a party? You're going to kill the fatted calf? No. And look at the brother, he says, this son of yours. This son of yours. I mean, you can feel the little venom there. This son of yours. And the father responds, what? This brother of yours. It's the brother of yours. Does the word ring a bell at all? Oikonomia. Sometimes you see the word oikos. That does not help, I know. But oikonomia is the Greek word out of which gives us the English word economy. Okay? It's literally translated household. That's what the word means. Okay? I often found it interesting, particularly in high school, at the time gone by, mostly girls did a course called what? Home economics, right? Which of course is redundant. It's kind of like talking about the Sahara Desert, because Sahara means desert, okay? Or the Potomac River, because you see where I'm going? Potomac means river. Okay, all right. So, home economics, right? Redundant. But the word means economics. And we can decide, do we want the economy of love that will shape us? And oh, by the way, go back here. What are the parameters of grace? Who deserves grace? Who decides that this far you can allow, but you can't go farther? Or who wants an economy of communion? An economy of conciliation. Remember the word that means assembly or unity. And the older brother could not bring himself. Could not bring himself. How does the text end? It ends quickly. He became angry, he refused to go in. His father came out and began to plead with him. But when he answered his father, listen, for all these years I have been working like a slave for you. I have never disobeyed your command. Yet you have never given me even a young goat that I might celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours came back, devoured all the property with prostitutes, you killed a fatted calf for him. And the father said to him, son, you are always with me, and all that is mine is yours. But we had to celebrate and rejoice. This brother of yours was dead and has come to life, was lost and was found. Here's what I will end on this note. The older brother believes in many respects that I have worked so hard, I have been diligent, I have stayed at home, I have committed myself, and on the basis of all of that is fill in the blank, I deserve. I deserve. Okay? So, you know, sometimes you build a story to a crescendo. You see the way this ends? Your brother was dead and has come back to life. It could end there. But maybe it's worse when you're lost. And so it builds up. Death and life is important. But to be found again, and importantly, to find yourself again in the depth of despair and have the courage for a homecoming. This is a homecoming for the ages. And he planned to tell his father, I have been a terrible son, I have sinned, I will work as a servant, I will do all of these things. And what does the father say? The father goes out to meet him with outstretched arms and welcomes him at home, and never allows him to say any of the speech that he had planned. Okay? It's welcome home to this son of mine. All right, we have to stop there. All right, there's no homework for next time, by the way, but breathe a sigh of relief. But we will go into the 5th Sunday in Lent.